Okay, I want to say that I was trained as an architect. I'm an artist and I do many things, but I'm inspired by the works of the artists who are in this symposium overall, but also particularly by the artists who are in this panel and the way they make me learn about learn architecture again from the work they do. And yes, the work they do, it either thinks about the how to read architecture in the remains of in paper or in documents or in stories, and sometimes they are conscious of the spatial construction and the spatial experience for the future to come, as like for the archive in the future to come. So we will not go by the order that is on the slide. We will start with Afra Dhaheri, and her bio will be in the chat box. تفضلي Afra.
Thank you, Ella. Thank you very much for inviting me and having me in this session. Thank you, Salwa. So let me just connect my slides. Okay, this should be fine now.
Yes.
All right, so my practice is a constant investigation of materiality and projected meanings that sit under the umbrella of how can we coexist with rapid change, slowly breaking down and unpacking the consequence of accelerated time on our day-to-day experiences, on our cultural ideologies, and social state of mind. Today, I will speak about 3 different works in my practice produced over the last 5 years that resonate with various forms of archiving. Hair as an archive of the body and cultural ideologies, monumentalizing collective memory, and works that archive and respond to a state of society. In 2018, I started collecting my naturally fallen hair after seeing a piece by Muna Hattoum at the NYU Abu Dhabi gallery, which was the hair necklace. And it's a piece that really touched me in that time and made me think about the significance of hair in our society. The relationship between hair as a material that can embody meaning, but then also act as a container for social ideologies and inherited societal constructs. So I started collecting hair as a material and developing methodologies to work with it as a response to this kind of fast-paced living that we live here, at least in the UAE. I wanted to slow down my practice. I wanted to experience my medium and processes for longer moments of time. And in doing so, I've started like taking these bundles of hair and detangling them one piece at a time, organizing them to actually then taking them back. In this image, for example, sorting the hair, organizing it, and then braiding it again as a form of process that a lot of times reminded me of seeing my grandmother sorting rice or cleaning rice. And it's a habitual practice that we don't engage in anymore. And I wonder like how that plays a role in our current state of mind. I developed a series of hair drawings where I started placing the hair on paper and using them as a way to release myself from being overly critical about painting. My background actually was, I did my MFA in painting at RISD, and I was constantly questioning, like, what am I painting? Why does it deserve to be painted? And so in this work, it freed me in a way because I used color mixing, which is something that I really love doing as a form of meditative process, but then also like a habitual practice of just allowing the hair to exist on a surface the way it wants without being controlled or placed in a way that it does not necessarily want to exist in. Moving on, I developed a couple of pieces. This is one at a time, where again, I am spending longer moments of time with the material and with the process of producing the work. I'm actually organizing these hairs one line at a time over a piece of fabric that extended 2 meters across the wall. So looking at hair as a measuring tape that can measure time, that has resonance with time, but also hair as a material that has the capacity to memorize form. When braided and then unbraided, it holds that form of the wave, and so it kind of also like unpacks texture and becomes a form of drawing formally looking at it. And then experimenting a bit further by also making the material become even more kind of generative, and it was a very generous material as well. So this is Too Pretty to Let Go, Too Heavy to Carry On, and it's a work where I took these individual braids that I had created from the collected hair, inserted them in these PVC tubes, and then braided those casted concrete at the bottom and the top, and it's kind of a conversation with the relevance of hair to my cultural upbringing, and so it's actually conversating with society and thinking about the thing that anchors you is also the thing that can bring you down, and so it becomes kind of like it holds a lot of layers of meaning. I was always interested in installation, sculpture, and construction. And so I was like, my hands were itching constantly, wanting to kind of expand this lexicon of language through meaning in the medium of my materials. And so the hair was something that presented me with delicate yet tactile artworks. And so I really wanted to expand beyond that. And how can I create works that are labor intensive, that also are suggestive of hidden labor associated with hair in the culture and so on. So I started experimenting with a lot of different materials until I arrived to cotton ropes, which at the beginning, I was not convinced to use cotton ropes as a representation for hair until I actually started using it and dealing with it the same way I deal with hair. And I realized that in this process, which is very laborious, we spent sometimes weeks to a month untwisting rope. So it's a collective kind of process that I do with some of the interns that I work with in my studio. And we bring the cotton ropes and untwist them to use them later in installations. And so this became a representation of hair in my work. And I only kind of approved and accepted that after the rope started responding the same way as hair. So when untwisted, it keeps the memory of the form that it existed in for a long time. So it holds on to this wave, and as you can see here, sorted and placed on the floor of my studio, organized and categorized to be taken into a different work. This is an example of a work that I've developed as a commission for Misk Art Institute. End of a School braid was basically this idea of growing up having thick and curly hair. In school, I used to feel shy about my hair because no one told me that this is actually a good thing. So I used to hide it inside my school uniform. And as a response to that and a celebration of my mother's labor of taking care of me at the time and my hair, and conforming to these cultural ideologies, I decided to create this piece that celebrates the school braid, and that's why I called it End of a School Braid. Moving to the next one, monumentalizing collective memory. So around, I think it was 2019, when I was approached to produce a commissioned piece for the Public Art Commission's part of Expo 2020 in Dubai. And I really struggled at the beginning to think about what would be a public work that I can present to my audience, and I wasn't sure if the personal narrative of hair that existed in my work at the time is relevant to the occasion or relevant to present to the public. I think it's very important that the conversation with the public, the conversation in public art has to resonate somehow with the public realm. So at the time, I looked at the development and the time and pace of which we're moving forward with as the development of the architectural landscape. And so the architectural landscape became a signifier through the passing of time. And so I remembered that as kids, we used to use these tekia, which is the pillow seatings that existed in all our living rooms in the past. And in days that allowed for afternoon naps, we actually used to turn the living room into a composition installation space by playing pillow fort, which is something that is universal as well. So I wanted to present it from my perspective, from my culture. And so, oops. So I decided to, when the curators asked me, what would you monumentalize in our contemporary world? And I immediately thought about, when thinking about the pillow forts, I thought about monumentalizing a collective memory. So it's monumentalizing a moment within the collective memory that exists within the society. And so the work becomes a representation of this collective memory that can be shared throughout generations, especially that it's a permanent artwork that still exists within Expo City right now. And so I actually produced the piece in marble, and it's 3 meter high. So actually you can walk underneath it. And it allows us to also think about a piece of architecture that doesn't exist inside our house anymore, because when we constructed them, we thought about them as houses, while these temporal architectures being assembled in our living rooms, at the same time the city was being permanently constructed outside of the house and into the city. So this becomes like a moment of link between generations to come, as today these pillows are replaced with Western sofas in our homes. Some close-ups. And the last work is works that archive and respond to a state of society. So recently I've been looking a lot into the works of philosopher Byung-Chul Han, specifically The Scent of Time, and he reflects on contemporary society's relationship to time and passing of time. And so always think we always have this feeling of that time runs away, or there isn't enough time to exist or practice and all our ambitions on a daily basis. But the reality is time is the same structure. We are outgrowing it. And it made me think a lot about our relationship to exhibitions, production, and how we produce content within exhibitions. How much time do we spend absorbing or digesting these contents? And so I really felt like if we're not anchored in a space by a conversation, we don't spend a lot of time in exhibitions to actually comprehend. But then within a studio space, how do we process our developments in our practice? Like, do we have enough time anymore to process what we have produced? Do we reflect? Do we contemplate? When do we linger? And so I really wanted to produce a work that touches the audience through a sensorial experience. So for the audience to come and experience a work that overstimulates them, actually. So it's the same mechanism that distracts them is the same mechanism that holds them in the space. And it's an immersive installation. As you can see, it was activated by light engineering and sound engineering. In the first iteration that still exists right now in NYU Abu Dhabi Art Gallery. And then the second iteration was commissioned for the Public Art Biennale in Abu Dhabi. And in the second iteration, what I wanted to specifically talk about is that it included a performance, and this performance I collaborated with Isa Najm, who's a Bahraini musician, and he would, in the performative act during the opening, what happened was that Isa was actually playing his music live, and his music comes from research and archives of the influence of African music in our Gulf music. So a lot of influences through slave industry, and a lot of influences also that come from different instruments that migrated through that time. And then the audience were invited to actually be part of the performance. So there is no stage, there is no spectator versus art. We are all in one space. On the other side of the room, I sit in front of Isa, and I was actually doing the complete opposite of what Isa was doing. Isa was moving from one instrument to the other, playing, and the light engineer was constantly moving the lights within the work. But there I sat and decided to do one consistent thing for an hour and a half, which is separating rice from nigella seeds, to keep that one anchoring point for the audience. So it becomes an ephemeral experience because you can only experience it during that performance, but then also it reflects and becomes an invitation for the audience to slow down and remember when they leave this space. I hope for the audience to remember the work through their senses, whether it's light experienced in a similar manner, sounds that they might hear that can bring back this memory. On the other side was Dario Feli, who was the composer. So he was simultaneously filtering the music from Isa and sending it back to the audience. Christy was our sound design, light designer, sorry. That's it. And the work is still up at the National Theatre in Abu Dhabi. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Preparing this way, I was inspired, in fact, for the concept of the next symposium, which is about how do we archive these sensorial overstimulating experiences. I would like to ask, thank you very, very much, Afra. We will come back to chat in almost less an hour. And I would like to invite now Akram Zaatari. Please share your presentation with us, and your bio is in the chat box.
Thank you. Thank you, Ala.
Thank you so much.
Hello, everyone. I'm in the south where internet is quite weak, but I think we're fine, right? You hear me well?
South of Lebanon. Yeah, I forgot to say. Yes,
So,
we hear you very well. Mhm.
Okay, excellent. I just want to share. I always forget. It's up somewhere up, right? Where? The share. Oh, yeah.
Yeah.
Super. So, many of you probably know my project with Hashim Al-Madani about his career, about his studio Shahrazad. This is a photographer who was born in 28 and who died in 2017. A photographer who has a very specific path because his father came from Saudi Arabia, from Al Madina, and his father was a religious figure who ended up in Sidon and met a woman he decided to marry and decided to stay in Lebanon. And therefore, it's then when he became Al Madani from Al Madina. Originally, the last name is Jamal al-Lail. So I met him in 1999 because I was interested in photographs of, I was doing a project called The Vehicle about means of transport and how it provided people with this transition time between one space to another. And I was introduced to him because he had photographed a lot of mechanics fixing cars in Saida. And our meeting went very well. Of course, I used some of his photographs back then, quite restricted to this thematic. And over time, he started accepting that I would go deeper in his archive. And I produced two chapters under this label, Object of Study, Studio Shahrazad. The first one was about studio space, really how people entered that space and started inventing and reinventing themselves. You know, people go to take a picture of themselves most of the time for a passport, for an ID. So a photograph is quite descriptive. In other terms, does not lie, should not lie, because it's an ID photograph. It should be a loyal description of who you are. But this specific studio happened to have a movie theater underneath, Cinema Shahrazad, and the studio was called Studio Shahrazad. So very often people would go up from the cinema and wanting to enact some scenes of the film. And we are inside 1949, because this is when the photographer started working, 1949 until the 80s. He stopped working in the 80s, but he still went to his studio. Anyway, I did two chapters with him on studio practices and promenades. Promenades was about areas for promenade in the city. So very, very tied to the history and the social history of the city, and urban history as well. And I picked four different locations that people went for promenades, like a river near the city, another like Saida is surrounded by two rivers from north and south. So Awari on the northern side, and uh, Al-Amli on the southern side. Here, this is the third one. And for the third one, I decided to do, this is, by the way, the three walls of the studio, Al-Madani. They are normally decorated with the best of what he has done. And this is him. Itinerary came when I saw photographs of people standing by their shops. Simple photographs, very, very repetitive. And I asked him about it. He told me that in the dead time in the day, in the afternoon, when people are doing their siesta or when people are having lunch, he would not have anyone come by the studio. So he decided to keep his assistant in the studio and to go out trying to look for customers outside the studio. And he would make a tour in the old city, uh, uh, offering people to take pictures of them. And this is how he ended up photographing the majority of the boutiques in the old city. Saida is by the seaside, by the Mediterranean. And interestingly, Saida is like it's an Islamic city that sits on top of Crusaders city, but it also was before a Roman and a Phoenician city. So all of these layers are one on top of another. It's a pedestrian city. But after the Israeli invasion of 1982, the government thought it was, since they were doing reconstruction, it was about time to implement modernist urban visions and to implement them. So in 1982, they seized the fact that a lot of the facade of the sea was destroyed. So here, the tip of the city where the port is was heavily destroyed. So they seized that opportunity, and all that is in red are vehicular streets. All what's in the middle are not vehicular streets, so they are all pedestrian. Madani would go into the city, go around it for 2 hours, and come back to the studio, probably having photographed 2 dozens of photographs or 3 dozens of photographs. And the photographs look like this. They are really typical photographs of um, men, you didn't know if they are visiting the shop, or you didn't know if they own the shop or they work there or not. And there, it's there where I started to challenge Madani by asking him about every single picture. So these were all 35 millimeter negatives, and I printed them. I printed tons of, like, the whole collection, actually, with the support of the Arab Image Foundation, which hosted this project and this archive. So I would go to him twice a week, spend time with him, and bring with me like thousands of small photographs. And I would write down on the back all the information. Sometimes he wouldn't know at all who the person is. Sometimes he would remember only the last name, like this is a Salami, from the last name of uh, family Salami. So, and one day I took him, okay, now you need to come with me. We'll go in the old city and you show me, and we try to find each shop. So I collected 41 photographs from the old city, and from all of them from the late 40s until the late 50s. I don't think any of them is in the 60s. Why? Because the 60s were busy times, and he would not have time to go around hunting for customers. So you see, they follow the same prototype. It's all kids or adolescents or older people standing by the door. Why by the door? He reminded me that these were times where Saida did not have electricity, so the inside of the shop would be too dark to take a picture. So he would ask them to be at the door, to stand up at the door. And of course, this is a chance to show the facade. This is Munir, one of few who I met and who were still alive. And I filmed him also for the installation. Normally, when I show this in space, I show with it interviews with the three people who were still alive. So you see the map on the left. The square tells you the area where this photograph is been taken. This is Souq Al Mutran. This is Souq Al Mutran, which is the commercial hub of the old city. You see the dots here. All the dots are locations of photographs. So once the one that is full tells you where this specific picture is. And on the right, this is the photograph installed in his shop. And this is another photograph of him too. And you see him on the right, older in age, with the picture on his left. And it goes repetitive. Sometimes the photographs are like these, for example, quite parallel to the facade because the photographer has enough setback to go back and take a picture. Sometimes it's less so. Sometimes it's too inclined. This is, for example, a famous jeweler, Nasan, Habib al Nasan. But this specific street is too tiny, so there is absolutely no setback, and it's a vaulted street. Until now, it's too dark, and it shows in the picture. So I'm gonna scroll through them quite quickly, not to waste time. And why am I doing it? Why am I doing it? Because I did an exercise. One day I asked myself, why do we call our act of taking pictures take a picture as opposed to photographing? Photographing is the right term, but in our slang, we say we take a picture. And it's the same in French and in Arabic. أخذت صورة, j'ai pris une photo. I took a picture. So taking is as if you are appropriating something that is not yours. You don't say I buy a picture. You say I take a picture, as if you took a flower off a tree. And I just for the pleasure of making the exercise, okay, what about returning a picture? So in this case, I took all the pictures that Madani had taken in the 50s in Saida, and I wanted to do an exercise in returning them. It was a way to know the souk also. It's the best way to go talk to someone in a shop, to tell them, hey, I have the picture of the shop 50 years ago. What about allowing me to install the photograph in your shop? Of course, you are at the mercy of the person. Sometimes they are not nice. You need to to pave the way to convince them. And most of the time, most of them finally were convinced, because this will give them exposure. The nice thing about the project is that I produced a map. So this is an exhibition that is not, it was not a momentary exhibition. It's an act of, it's a generous act from me and the Arab Image Foundation to donate these photographs to the shop owners. And they can do with it whatever they want. And some of them kept it in the shop for a while, and some of them removed it after a year. But I'm really not less interested in trying to find out what happened and maintaining it. Khalil Shami is a very interesting. This is Salim Basil, who used to work at Khalil Shami, and this is also someone who I encountered. Um, you see that this square has a concentration of commercial uh, activity. This is also Jamil Al-Utubi. He was a very, very known person. Everyone knows him. Whenever I showed his picture to people on the street, they would recognize him, although he had died like 30 years before. I guess time is running up, right?
You have like around 3 more minutes, or if you want.
So I'll wrap up with this. Photographs are really the best way to open discussion. So I take a picture somewhere, and I'm sitting with this person trying to identify people in it, and 10 minutes later I'll look around and I'll see around us 10 people at least. All of them are intervening in our discussion. And this is the first time when I realized actually something that I did not believe in before. I always took photographs as works of art. And they're part of my studies, but also they are part of my practice. When I decided to study photographs, it meant studying the lives of others. And there is, in my mind, there was this. It's a kind of opposition. Yes. Do you like a picture because you like the person in it, or do you like a picture because of the light, because of the photograph is able to radiate with, because of composition, because of art's history? And all of a sudden, while working with this project, I realized that the value of photographs for all these people are about locations and people. And it's in a way, it was a good grounding for me as a visual artist to go back to location and to see how the value of photographs have nothing to do with art history. They have to do with community. They have to do with how people love their own city, how people are interested in the history only because it's the history of the location they are working at. So it was really an amazing lesson, and all these people, I have stories about them, and because I returned to the same location with my eyes and with my camera and documented all these shops properly, and all the new owners of the shops, and I also filmed them, yeah, just. But this is. Uh, Again, this is not an exhibition, this is an intervention. And an intervention is in between performative and it's between the visual arts and performance art. I felt here that I am performing with the images of other people and bringing them back to location. Yeah, that's it.
Thank you so very much. Yeah, I think it's fascinating. I was also paying attention to how you include the names under, each image, and that's also a great work of, great documentary work. Besides also being curiosity of the artist, or also like your own research. We will come back to you with more questions after we hear the rest of the panelists. Thank you so much, Akram. I would like now to invite Meitha Al Mazrooei to take the floor.
Hi, everyone. It's nice to speak among friends I admire. I'll share my screen and start. I'll be sharing with you excerpts from my writing project that aims to foreground the importance of the sensory in reading the history of the Arabian Gulf. As an architect, I was taught to look at dimensions and forms, but I really think that my profession misses a big part, which is the sensorial factors that are both parts and beyond the object. I believe smell is so important in how we inhabit architecture and is a central feature of both recalling place and recalling the memory of a place. And in my personal work, I try to go back to the medieval Islamic culture to see where and how social value towards aroma begin to take shape. I want to start with a detailed image of an archive from the Abbasid Empire, which highlights the active way that people of the period were investing in documenting knowledge. For me, this illustration captures the importance of archiving to the Abbasids. Although there weren't many architectural and archaeological remains from their 500-year reign, they left a wealth of textual documents. And also, as you can see here on the slide, documenting the representation of books in their own books was crucial to them. And knowing that we've inherited this rich textual archive, I approached the documents from the period, such as caliphal accounts, recipe books, and diaries, and travel logs as well, with an interest in whether they contained references to scent on the pages. So it's in the text, and it's in the language used, and it's in the descriptions of space within these documents that we can begin to read how people of that time lived. I took on this process because we all have examples of experiences of being in a place like a 1970s building. Scent reminds us of our own personal histories and helps us recreate them imaginatively. So why has architecture history ignored it, and why has it prioritized an archival analysis of plans, massing, and drawings? The theoretical arc of my project, I have to mention, is inspired by Constant Klassen, who reimagines objects in history through a sensory analysis that includes touch, smell, and sound. She asserts that in the 18th and 19th centuries, philosophers and scientists decided that while sight was a preeminent sense of reason and civilization, smell was a sense of madness and savagery. So this was my starting point, is that the sense of smell offers a way to bring to life the lived experience of a period more fully, which is especially true of understanding architecture since it's both inhabited and occupied. One of my core questions throughout this process, research process, has been what is revealed when we look at the textual archive for evidence or references to smell. And I've organized the forms that fragrance meets into three categories. The first is the perfume body, the second is perfume building, and the perfumed setting. I'll start with the setting. And I'll share an example from, and I want to emphasize here, a legal manuscript called The Observations and Tales of a Mesopotamian Judge. That describes how fragrance enters the setting. Preparing for the first day of spring and the New Year's celebration of Nowruz, which means New Day, Queen Shaghab, the mother of Al-Muqtadir, requested 1,000 pieces of an exceedingly light Dhaheri cloth to be delivered to the palace. Her assistant, Khiragi, collected the cloths and brought them to her, where she ordered him to have tailors come to prepare them to be soaked in expensive perfumed oils that could then be burned as guests gathered for an evening of annual festivities. This instruction was for tailors to cut the fine Dhaheri cloth into buttons in the size of cotton pods or hab al-qutn, which the general masses in Baghdad then used. But they used them to soak in perfumes and burn them in clay censers in their homes. But for Queen Shaghab, cotton wasn't luxurious enough, nor was clay. Only delicate fabrics and carved stone censers were adequate for her. Once tailored into buttons, the cloth was then soaked in an oil of balsam and other expensive fragrant oils, and strategically placed in stone censers on the tops of the walls on the nights of the New Year. One could imagine that visitors at that time of Queen Shaghab may have been just as struck, if not more, by the potency of the woody smell of balsam filling their nostrils, as they would be visually awed by the scale of the room and the height of the ceiling and the intricate details of the muqarna stone, which is the stucco carving you see. But it's not surprising when reading this level of excess and flamboyancy that Al-Muqtadir's reign is conventionally also identified as the beginning of Abbasid decline. From the same legal document, there's another example of how perfume is used to amplify an ambience. Caliph al-Mutawakkil once wanted everything his eye touched to be yellow, and he spent 50,000 dinars to do this by ordering servants to pour saffron into the palace's water channels and build a dome of sandalwood above it. These two examples have a sense of engulfing the setting with fragrance, which was a characteristic practice among the more wealthier circles in the Abbasid Caliphate, who started to use copious amounts of scented materials to recreate scenes and experiences of paradise on earth. For the upper echelons of society, the burden of entry into paradise wasn't piety so much as a privilege. Those who could afford to accumulate expensive scents could perform paradise literally in their back gardens. It went so far that Muqtadir requested that the soil be drenched with valuable musk, like in his garden, or fertilizer mixed with musk. And also a geographer, another account from a geographer, al-Baghdadi, he spoke of fountains spouting of perfumes, astounding the senses. But what was the origin of this practice and this desire? I looked back at the establishment of Islam, and descriptions of paradise would often include mentioning specific aromatic materials, such as this hadith that you could see on the screen. It describes materials of heaven that contain musk as its mortar. To transition to like the ideas of perfuming the body, words like drenched, layered, soaked appear in the textual descriptions of how people applied these fragrant materials to their bodies. This is especially important in the case of the Prophet, whose head would glisten with musk. The practice of lavishing perfume onto the body of the Prophet was later, I mention this because it was later replicated in how empires that followed his death, specifically the Umayyads and the Abbasids, intervened to perfume sacred architectural sites or surfaces. There is an enchanting example in one of the travel logs of Ibn Jubayr, who was a 12th century voyager, and he describes a visit to the Prophet's mosque in Medina when the Abbasids were the caretakers. One of the elements he mentions is a wall at the mosque built around the Prophet's burial site, where the bottom part of the wall was made out of marble, the middle section was coated in perfume or tib, and the remaining part of the wall was made out of fragrant aloes wood and delicate aloes wood that reached the ceiling. Ibn Jubayr goes on to describe that the tib covering the central, or perfume covering the central part of the wall, consisted of musk and a type of perfume paste that was around 23 centimeters deep and had dried because of the sun. Similarly, there was a practice of coating the surface of the Kaaba, which is approximately 630 square meters, first under the Umayyads with a saffron paste called khaluq, and then a compound paste of musk and ambergris called ghaliya during the Abbasids. I won't go into this now, but saffron scents were gendered then, or were perceived as gendered, and saffron was considered a feminine scent, while musk and ambergris were strictly masculine. In a very sort of reductionist form, the Kaaba went from smelling like a woman essentially to smelling like a man. And this could also mirror the transition of Islamic jurisprudence or madhab from the Umayyads to the Abbasids. I would like to read this quote that I found to be very evocative to the language of drenching that I had mentioned earlier. It's from the 9th century account of Al-Azraqi, who took part in the perfuming of the Kaaba, and he says, "We climbed atop of the rear of the Kaaba with bottles of ghaliya and poured them out upon the Kaaba walls from every side. Servants of the Kaaba had peeled up the coverings with pulleys and painted its walls with ghaliya from top to bottom." I honestly didn't really know what I would find when I started reading these documents, but what I have discovered is that the role of scent in the designing of architectural space in the early Islamic years was not accidental, and it was quite intentional. For instance, Caliph al-Mansur, who chose Baghdad as a location for the empire's capital because of the direction of the breeze and the quality of the air, he burned cotton seed oil on the outlines of the city to visualize it, but also perhaps to understand how odor is carried through the city as cotton seeds release an oil that's quite musky in fragrance when it's broken. And the smell of the city was central to the planning. In the most obvious ways, the butcher's market, for instance, was placed on the outer outskirts of the city, and it's recorded for not wanting it sort of to be close to everyday life. And in the textual descriptions in the archive, articulate how the Abbasids conceived and thought of their atmosphere. So they were very much aware of their air and or ajwa. And the root of this word carries many emotive meanings. Yes, it means atmosphere and weather, but it also means mood and ambience as well. And I say this because during the periods, pleasant smells were an indication of healthy atmospheres. And unlike modern times, concepts of good health and pleasant aromas were very much interconnected. And there was an explicit link between perfume and pharmacology. Ibn Musawiya, who was a physician and translated Greek practices and brought them into like the medical Arab repertoire, identifies in his work that there are 5 aromatic materials such as musk, ambergris, camphor, and saffron, and aloes wood as baseline healing agents in his recipes or in medicinal recipes.
Dear
Aroma.
Meitha, I'm
Sorry?
very much enjoying the presentation, but you have 2 more minutes. I just want Is that
Okay, I
okay?
think I can end here where
No, give us a
okay.
setting.
Okay, aroma forces us to engage with the question of what constitutes architecture, and it could be understood more broadly to encompass materials that are more impermanent, I think, in space. And in addition to leaving you with this question, I wanted to leave you with this image. It illustrates a woman giving birth in the center of the page with a man seated above. But what I wanted to draw your attention to was the edge of the page where fragrance often lies. And on the bottom left stands a feminine figure holding a large incense burner. Maybe frankincense, perhaps to calm the woman's nerves or to purify the air of unpleasant smells of childbirth. The portrayal of fragrance in this image is subtle, as though it was designed to be missed or passed over by the viewer, but yet for it to be depicted in this document and in this way shows that it carries important social, ritualistic, or even practical reasons because of childbirth and all its pungent smells where it happened, where it took place in the domestic space. And in this way, it could maintain, fragrance could have served the purpose of maintaining an aura or a joe that kept the environment pristine no matter what was happening within the courts. And thank you all for your attention, especially Ala and Salwa for taking the time to organize the presentations today.
Thank you very, very much. Sorry to have cut you, but I regret that already. But it was really fascinating. Thank you so much. I will ask now Hannah Elsisi, please, to share her presentation with us, and we will come back with questions afterwards.
Hi, everyone.
Hannah's,
How's it going? Thanks, Ala and Salwa, for having me. Ala, should I send over my PowerPoint to you?
yes, and you want me to share it? Yes, of course.
So thanks for inviting me. I've got some sort of broad comments about the relationship between social history, art history, and architectural history as they relate to difficult, inaccessible, disappearing, or foreclosed archives. I'm a historian, or more recently, I've moved on to more happy pastures. I've been thinking about music and migration. But for a good 7-8 years, I sat quite closely with the histories of imprisonment and torture in the Arabic-speaking and Islamic world, mostly in the modern period, but more or less beginning in the sort of 14th century through to the 1980s and of course the present moment. And one of the difficulties with trying to, a lot of you might have remembered the images coming out of Saidnaya, how sort of shocking they were, but the kind of impulse to watch more, to consume more of this space that so many of us and several generations had been imagining and hearing about in literature, in film, in art, in autobiography, in novel, without sort of the kind of photographic or architectural plans to really sort of give that history a material kind of form. And so in trying to write the histories of imprisonment, especially in modern Egypt, and of political imprisonment in modern Egypt, you really come up against the problem that unless you're going to end up as a prisoner yourself, for the most part, it's very difficult to really spatialize, to have a sense of what these spaces are. But prisons, of course, are primarily a spatial experience or a spatiotemporal experience. What they do is compress space-time. So how the hell do you go about really trying to capture or come to terms with that kind of history without a sense of what that place looks like? And in my case, the other issue, of course, is that as sites and spaces of repression, the archives of prisons and police authorities are especially foreclosed, even more so than the general sort of archive of modern Middle East history. And what that meant is that I mostly sat with oral history, conducting sort of hundreds, perhaps 1,000 oral history interviews, autobiography, the novel, and art. As a way to sort of construct a kind of collage in lieu of the state archive to build a broad sort of social, political, and literary history of the institution of the Mu'taqal. And one of the, Alaa, did you receive the PowerPoint? Yeah, I mean, you can just open it and then I guess
I just
sort of
received it, so now I'm gonna share.
run through it. But how do you go about doing that? And, you know, to sort of my interlocutor's chagrin, one of the things that I basically started to do very early on, I was still an MPhil student at the time, is that I would take note of every single spatial descriptor and measure in any interview or any novel or autobiography or testimony that I read. This means that this means that the former leader of the Egyptian Communist Party might be in the middle of giving me that very important theory of Nasserism, and meanwhile I'm mostly concerned with how high were the windows, how many steps did it take to get to the horse urinals, and partly that was about trying to get a sort of spatial measure of their freedom or unfreedom. And I mean, Le Corbusier once said that taking possession of space is sort of the first gesture of living things. And of course, the architecture of the Mu'taqal, its spatial organization and properties, is the first thing that political prisoners are confronted with on entering their new homes. And as soon as they're sort of in the cell, they start taking stock of their surroundings, cataloging the dimensions of their cell, which might become their home for the next 20 years, the crowding ratio of prisoner to cell size, distance from toilets, from air, from light, and the quality of light, the lack of beds, and what have you, scent, sound, and texture. And I think this is in great sort of conversation with the last speaker's presentation, really seem to overpower all else in the crammed space-time of the Mu'taqal. And in those conditions, basically, prisoners begin to pace the circumference of their cell by the second or the third day, realizing that this is where they're bound to be for a very long time, or the courtyard, carefully counting the steps and more or less the exact spatial measure of their freedom. The communist Fawzi Habashi, who you can see here on the left, recalls these mental measurements of many of the 12 prisons that he entered over the course of his lifetime. And of his first stint in 1948 at the Huck Step camp, that's map 5, Alaa, which was a former military barracks near Suez, he writes, and I quote, "I went out crossing a distance of roughly 50 meters in the open air towards the toilets. These were comprised of 2 halls, each no greater than 30 square meters, separated by a small door. One of the halls was a hammam with shower heads next to each other on the walls. The second hall was a multi-purpose room, for it was a toilet with 2 rows of urinals in the center and 2 rows of European toilet seats without covers on each side of the room, with no dividers nor doors. Thus the toilets were closer to public horse urinals. I went in to shower and found 2 comrades sitting on 2 adjacent toilets discussing complex political issues. And I told myself, how is this a place for political discussion? I washed my cup and showered and went out to stand in the morning roll call, and from there to the physical exercise group, and then on to my free round along the barbed wire, from the inside, of course. And as is the case for all prisoners, it occurred to me to calculate my steps for the entire distance of the tour, or in other words, the metric measure of my freedom. It did not exceed half a fadden, roughly 2,000 square meters." These are the sorts of ephemeral kind of texts or speech acts from which I tried to construct maps and plans of 16 prisons, mostly, many of them still in operation in 20th century Egypt. The other relationship that I want to sort of reflect on is the ways in which prisoners and political prisoners take hold of space. The 1950s in Egypt were an especially kind of heightened time of repression, as is the case in the first decade following a coup or a revolution or counter-revolution. But by the 1960s, relations between both brothers, Muslim brothers and communists, had begun to thaw significantly with a now much more comfortable and confident Nasserist regime. It's around that time that Inji Aflatun, the famous surrealist artist, who I know Selwa works on and whose work forms several of the collections now at the Guggenheim are here, began her most famous series, actually, which was a reflection on a tree in the courtyard of El Anatir prison. And one of the interesting things is that in the testimonies of later generations of women political prisoners, students arrested in the student movement of 1972-73, and then members of various political parties arrested in the 1981 campaign, is that they would find etched into the walls of their cells reflections by generation on generation, inscribed into the walls on not only this tree, but on poems that were written about the tree and letters that Inji herself was writing to her sister from Al Anatir prison, from which segments were then eulogized into the very architecture and materiality of the prison. 900 or 1,000 sort of kilometers southwest of Cairo in El Wahed, on the other hand, prisoners, again, were likely to be staying there for quite a long time. And what they did is they constructed an entire publishing, theater, filming, and writing and translating operation. They also constructed a humongous amphitheater in their desert encampment at El Wahed. The materials that they used for this were entirely garnered from the grounds of the encampment itself. They rolled sand, and the geologists and the architects amongst them used various materials from soot and what have you to form bricks, which they then sun-dried and eventually started to build this Roman theater. The first thing that they showed at that theater was a reinterpretation of the Barber of Baghdad. But so this particular operation happens to have been one of the most important sort of moments in the history of both theater and literature in Egypt. Many of the most famous films, play scripts, and novels of the modernist Arabic canon were formed and forged and written and first performed in that prison and in that site. Now, that site has now been demolished. And I suppose the very brief comments, and I'll leave it here for today, that I wanted to share with you all was more recently in working as a curator with artists in the last few years, is the extent to which, as historians, architects, and artists, because we don't work together, we don't borrow enough from each other's skills. And as you can see, a lot of these maps and plans, if I had the skills of an illustrator, of an artist, or of an architectural engineer, I might have constructed much better plans for the case. But the converse is also true. I find that archival training for contemporary artists is often quite wanton and lacking. And I've taken a sort of great pleasure more recently in kind of exchanging and sharing these various expertise to think differently and more, let's say, creatively about how we might tell histories in the absence and in the increasing absence of formal archives. I'll leave it there. خلاص آلاء. كفي.
Thank you very much. Yes. Okay, one moment. Okay. Thank you very much, everyone. I think there is something fascinating in how presentations talk to each other, and it's very difficult to decide who to start with. But it was very, very interesting to see how in Afra's presentation, there is this, she's busy thinking about the moment, about how, the moment is being perceived and what we are taking with us from the moment as we are standing in front of works or as we are encountering activation of art presentations or activities. And her way to respond to that is basically to create further simulating environments that basically resonate with that busyness, with that space that is not there to be just seen on its own, but rather it's kind of being used in mixed ways. So for instance, in the conversation we had in preparation, you've mentioned how like you're being in an opening, but people are not looking at the art, they are talking. And then, but at the same time, there are also many opportunities for artists to produce or to exhibit their work. And so you feel that the scene is full, but at the same time, how much we take from the moment when we are standing in front of these works. Maybe I start asking you about these archives of the future. I mean, we also see in your work that you've come back to conditions or situations or formations that belong to, for instance, living rooms in which you monumentalize, but you are also bringing something from the past to stay in a very, very present way in a very monumental way in the present. But where we are or what we are taking from these into the future. What are we? How do you feel that this is going to be revisited in the future? What are they? What is the future comment on this work, for instance?
That's a very big question, Ella. I don't know. I tend to think a lot, and I think we had this conversation earlier. I think a lot about like what art historians will be looking for in the works that is being made today. And I think that in living in like abundance of opportunities here in the UAE, specifically in an like scene that is rapidly growing culturally, and there's obviously like the government support and all of that, all the intentions of making this somehow like a cultural hub for the world, keeps me questioning like, okay, we have all these opportunities. What are we making with them? Why do we opt out of challenging what we make, and instead we end up making works just for exhibit and sales that have been done before, or that have been digested or processed by perhaps Western narratives and Western ways of making that existed in maybe places that we studied, right? So I keep questioning that, and I always wonder, like, how would like the question that comes back to me is that if historians are looking back at this moment of such a fertile ground, what would they see artists have done with it? And how did this, because, everything is a two-way road. Like it could be a benefit, but at the same time, it could also hurt your career. And so I always wonder, like, if they look back and question, how did this abundance affect the artists' community or their ways of production and making? So yeah, I guess
Yes. I asked the question because I am asking as well myself about, the consciousness that we have of the acts of writing that is very very much available and very much readable. I mean, it's not that it wasn't available in previous times, it's just the accessibility is amplified in the moment. And Yeah, I am challenged most of the time to read texts because they sound to me the same. But when it comes to artists talking about their art or the way they think or the way they trace what they have produced, things start to make sense more, or you start to understand something that is beyond what is being articulated in a piece of text. And perhaps I take my question now to Akram. I found, as I said, like it's fascinating how you end up knowing every person in your pictures. So you're not only like identifying the names of the people, the locations of the shops, but also how these shops look today, how they transformed or what they've landed in which type of business. And in fact, you are also meeting the extended family of, the shop owners or users, which is a lot to take as an artist who comes to arrive to a collection, being interested partly in aesthetically and also partly practice-wise, to end up with, like embroiled or like just caught up in the social history of a place or the social use of a place. Yeah, tell us about how you like going there and leaving from there, like going to the location with your images and then leaving from there. How is it different in your
Um,
mind?
It's uh, it's great, and sometimes it's too sticky also because you want to go back home. You don't want to bring all the requests and
Yeah.
all the people with you home. I mean, but you need to live with this. As an archaeologist, you do live with it. But with archaeology, you're confronting ancient times. You're confronting people who died 2,000 or 3,000 years ago. But here it's a bit different. And no matter how you treat photographs, as I said, as works of art, when you go to location, they are not works of arts. They are the pictures of so and so and so when this and this happened at that specific location. So it becomes an archaeology of different sort, an archaeology of modern times, an archaeology of uh, a city that is home also.
Right.
Yeah.
Right. Yeah.
But you can do only such a project once in a lifetime, to be honest, because I met Madani in 1999, and until today, I did not unfold all this collection. It's so much laborious. It's also very costly. I mean, the cost of digitizing has been handled by through the Arab Image Foundation, so it made it a bit easier. But the labor needed to identify photographs. Sometimes, by the way, people identify the same person, give them two different possibilities, and you need to live with this duality. Sometimes you will not find the name of the person. But normally, I privilege showing the pictures of the people I know. So, in other terms, a lot of the photographs of people I could not find names for stayed in the archive until we are able to process them properly. Naming
Yeah.
is really, really important. I mean, in the history of civilization, naming is so important.
Yes, and it's like maybe I ask also another question to you about this. I felt that it was fascinating when you explained how the shop owners were brought to the doors, and because of the distance, the tight, how did you call it, backdrop?
No
Uh,
setback.
the
You need a setback in order to
setback,
return.
yes. Yes, and then but then it ends up like you're taking this like 3D it's like perspectival it's going towards vanishing point photograph of people, but also of this architecture of the shop, which um, I thought that it was fascinating that what seems to be an extension of artist experiments in painting and like perspectival painting, it becomes or renders itself as a necessity in the environment where the shops or the architecture doesn't allow too much navigation of the straightforward like photographing. But that, how did you, when you were producing your images yourself, taking these shots, were you thinking about this dimension? Were you thinking about the architecture, how the architecture comes out versus how the current situation is also being documented in the project?
I did the same exercise as Madani. I took a camera with a single lens, not a zoom lens, so I could not sit down and use a wide angle. So I took just a medium wide angle lens with me, and I had to take decisions on site. I did not copy exactly the same angles he took. I did it on my own, and normally in the single time when I showed this once in a gallery space, because I always thought this project belongs to Saida. I don't need to recreate it in a museum. But one time I got this very genuine request from the photographer's curator at Moderna Museet in Stockholm. He insisted that we show it, and I didn't mind. So I showed them as two separate blocks, two separate series. What Madani photographed is on one side, and what I photographed is another side. And the only common thing are the boutiques, not the people. Of course, three people were in both
Okay.
in both series, but the rest of them are just the shops, not the people.
Thank you. Encourage also the audience to put questions in the Q&A. It's nice to hear from you on your thoughts. Maybe I go now to Meitha, and because of this idea or the question of naming and how it's very important to, in Akram's practice, to think and acknowledge the people who appear in the images. It is very fascinating also in the way you, Meitha, have read these texts and pulled out relations to space and to what permeates through space from like sense, and what possibly was the use of that location or that room or that piece of architecture, or even when you describe the burning of the outline of the Baghdad to be built. But then the stories are mostly about famous figures, or perhaps like rulers or wives of rulers and stuff, which is fascinating. I mean, it's important to understand that dimension, and I think you've done great work guiding us through that. But were there in the resources that you found something about, for instance, shop owners or other types of lesser access to luxury, or lesser access to to, I don't know, like maybe another type of environment that is available in the written narratives about scent in non-governmental spaces?
There are mentions of markets, but not names or owners of markets. And I think for me, the authority or the chain of transmitters who relay this information within, like the Tanuhi book, the judge documents, that those chains of transmission, or the people who relay these stories, to me are just as important as because it shows that they were in the space. Granted, they're close to a government body and they're close to the ruling sort of class, let's say. And then where people, or maybe sort of other individuals, come into play are when they're at fault with the state, let's say. And there are names that are mentioned as like general landowners, perhaps, that are in dispute, or have been poisoned, for example, using scent, or have been gifted large amounts of perfume as well. So this is when different sort of individuals or names come into play, but it's hard to also map their exact association, because those narratives are written in little vignettes with no value judgment associated to them as well. So it's not, they're not random, but they're a collection of snippets and act as like precedents for rule, or so that's how, like, I would suppose other characters come in.
And then have you tried the sense, like yourself, have you burned cotton, or like how do you bring back to this time, to our time, these like traces of stories and descriptions of situations? How do you experience them today, or what, like on what library of sense do you rely?
Early on, I had started this project solely looking at recipe books, and that didn't give me enough in terms of just thinking how they were applied. But what it did allow for is one to test a few, and I was also really sort of trying to capture the element of labor and where the production happened, or the quantity, or the tools, even like the sizes of the tools needed. And there was just not enough in the archive to sort of, there wasn't enough evidence to sort of build from, to sort of identify labor. But when I would try them, I think it was always just so shocking how long it would take to make a single recipe, not just like in terms of how long you would need to stand there to stir, but also just the duration of leaving certain materials out to dry, or for them to be sort of crushed or compounded after a certain amount of time. So it was also that production time that isn't necessarily understood when in the sort of more anecdotal references, they're already mentioned as oils or pastes, or like they're materials ready to be used, but not prepped. And that I've been trying really hard, honestly, to locate like sites of production. And it's hard because like the sites of agriculture, or the sites of where the product is traded, is mentioned, and where it ends up, whether a market, a perfume market, or where it's applied, is mentioned, but everything in between is sort of, I mean, I haven't found it, but yeah.
Well, that makes me think about, that made me think about also when you said first of all, that you've come to this part of this type of knowledge to look into, and you were mentioning how this history of architecture doesn't come to look at these types of narratives. But then when you asked the question, were they quoted, or where they were inspired, or where did they learn the idea from, or basically where did they source the information or the reference from, and then you quote the hadith and the Quran. And I was thinking, yes, this is perhaps the conceptual inspiration of how to turn a space into something. And then what about the practical, like if they have thought about turning a room into, a garden or a paradise of musk, how would the scientists or the perfume makers knew how to do that and experiment on it? And so that technical knowledge, I thought that was also fascinating to trace.
They had a khazanat atr in the palace, so that's how it would be mentioned, that they would recall material from the khazana. So it was already a musk oil or a paste. And there are descriptions of like opening vessels, and some men would sort of graze their beards on the tip of the vessel, for instance. So there are those descriptions of sort of knowing how it was carried, how it was brought. There's also a performative element of it to be brought from a particular room to be shown.
Nice.
Yeah.
Thank you. And maybe I ask Hannah if she's on. Yes. So I also find these like narratives, these like interviews of political prisoners, and trying to illustrate the map of the prison or the cells, or even their life inside the prison, from like going to the washrooms, going back to their cell, or taking the breaks inside in the open air, wherever that was there, was fascinating to me to realize that you've done that from interviewing people who were very old, besides of course reading all these materials and talking talking heads inside like written narratives, you were also talking to people who I remember that you once told me that they have described to you situations that by you attempting to make the drawing, you figured out that they are describing a different prison than what they call that prison. And that kind of also helps you verify some of the narratives or some of the stories that were told to you as in the process when you were trying to. Yeah, so maybe you tell us about this act of trying to create a benchmark in which you were trying to verify the look of a prison from the different testimonies from people who have lost maybe a good chunk of their memory with time because they were old when you met them.
Memory is a wondrous thing. You know, and I take seriously the insight of, you know, memory studies scholars that memories are created in that moment. There isn't a sort of box of memories that you kind of extract things from. But one thing that I found, the one detail that a prisoner will never forget is who they slept next to. And often it is through that very particular detail that I could end up placing the time, the date, the year, the prison that many of them were in. But also what this means is that it was a constant process of going back over and a sort of a matrix of going back over and over and over again over many of the testimony, some of which are very large events. For example, the murder of 27 Muslim brothers in Signatura in 1957, a sort of momentous event that tends to override the memory making and narrative making of Muslim brothers, Magzaratura. Right. And you'll often, whatever story they're telling, it might be the 60s, the 70s, they might be in Asyut prison. You will find elements of that, of the 2 days leading up to and the day of that massacre overriding, right? And being sort of braided into the stories that they tell. And I take that as indicative, as effectively indicative of their experience of imprisonment and the ways in which those personal experiences, in fact, become very collective. They're experienced collectively and remembered collectively. But equally by that same token, it's often by kind of trying to pin down precisely who was where, in which corner of what prison, on what date, having arrived at what time, that you can really start to build not just a timeline of these prisoners' experiences, but also a better understanding of how the state is operating. Right. We don't really have another way of really understanding why and how, you know, a prisons authority in the south of Egypt might receive a call to tell them to transfer 600 prisoners to another prison, let's say in central Cairo, why and when they might be sent before a court or transferred to a third prison in the middle of a desert, or, for example, in, if I share my screen, one of their favorite encampments was definitely that in a Tur in the Sinai, because this was a camp that was on the sea. Here we go. And you can, where's the other one? This is what that looked like. But they were transported, for example, to El Tur by boat. And they all had again quite different narratives of this particular boat trip. But one thing that overrode every single testimony was the idea that they were on the King's boat, after which the opera is also named. And with time, you realize that no, there was one occasion of over 50 crossings to El Tur, where in fact there was a group of pilgrimage goers that were being quarantined in the Sinai. And a group of about 70 prisoners was addended to the pilgrimage goers and put on Aida to go to the Sinai. But other than that, they weren't.
Maybe you tell us about NG Aflatun. I'm sure many people in the audience, they are curious to know what did you find about NG Aflatun's
India. Yeah. So she let me show you something. Ah, no, no, no. Right. This little child here. So another thing is again, if you think of there's a chap called Tariq al-Mahdawi, and Alet knows this. I've been obsessing over his father for a long time, and I hope that his granddaughter will one day write this book, because I don't know that I will. But Ismail Mahdawi was at some point, anyway, he was disappeared into the asylum for 20 years, which was another site of incarceration, not only in Egypt, but also in Soviet Russia, and to a lesser extent in Ba'athist Syria. His son, Tariq al-Mahdawi, a sort of talking head and writer and journalist, I'd interviewed him on a couple of occasions. And every time I'd ask him, where were you born? He'd come up with a different story. And at some point I was like, Tariq, طيب, which one is true? Well, I take the one that you prefer. But I personally don't like the story where I was born in the hospital, and therefore I was the reason that my mother and my father finally had to come out of hiding. I prefer the story where I was born in prison. This will often actually happen, where your interlocutor actually can't be bothered to doesn't really think too much of the idea of historical objectivity, and I have time for that. Fast forward many years. Anyway, Zayed, his mother died, and as did his father. There's a film and a very famous novel called Hikayat Tu by the writer Fathi Ghanem, who also used to be the editor-in-chief of some of Egypt's largest organs. And there are elements in the story where you can recognize the braiding of different characters, right? Shohdi Atiyah, a communist leader, to my mind, Ismail al-Mahdawi, and Inji Aflatun, as well as the auntie of this young man who has grown up without his parents, right? And I remember going back to at some point through some of Inji's paintings, and these are now, there isn't really a full catalogue. I don't know if that's something that Selo is working on, but you really have to kind of triangulate between a great deal of private collections, some of the archives that were held by her family and her comrades, the museum here in Cairo, and a bunch of other places besides. And there's this baby hanging in several of her paintings. These are from the early 60s. This is before she started obsessing over this tree, which was also the subject of Ma'in Basiso, the Palestinian, ended up in Signal Anatar al-Rigal at some point. And the men's prison and the women's prison, one section of them, both overlook this courtyard and this tree. And so it's been a sort of productive boon for both modernist literature and surrealist art in the Egyptian canon, this particular tree in Al-Anatar. But going back through her autobiography, which was kind of co-authored, she mentions a young boy called Tu. And it turns out that this baby is in fact Tariq, right? And if it weren't for the painting, I wouldn't have gone back over sort of her writing to sort of see the odd mention of this child, in order to verify that he was not, in fact, born in prison, but that Zayed entered with him, as she puts it in her autobiography, on her bosoms with intense internal bleeding and malnutrition. But these are some of the ways in which literature, art, and architecture can carry inscriptions with them that allow us to triangulate a bit better, or a slightly better sort of sense of what might have happened instead of what definitely happened. But I take seriously prisoners' sort of nonchalance about whether it was them or their comrade. What does it matter? This could have happened to any of them, right? And I take that quite seriously.
In fact, we have two questions from the audience. One of them is for you, Hannah, so I'll stay with you. Andrew is asking you that Azzeddin Naguib's last novel, Musafir Khana, deals with a few of his prison sentences. If Andrew's asking if this work is on your radar, and do you know anything about the prison he was in?
No, I don't at all. Is this when was Azzeddin Naguib imprisoned?
We are at Al Mawrid. We almost have signed agreement with Azzuddin Naguib, Allah yarhamah, like the late Azzuddin Naguib, to bring his papers into Al Mawrid's digital archive. It might still happen, or it might be already happening in the process. That's with the team in Cairo, but
Actually,
Salwa can.
yeah, we actually interviewed him several times over the last, before he passed away.
Okay.
And unfortunately, while we were working with him, he got really sick. Now, we did sign an agreement with his daughter over 7 months ago, and we started already sorting through the material, he was imprisoned twice. I don't have the exact date, but for short periods, one time for 3 weeks, one time for a similar period. So, but we can,
I mean,
but it is in
enigma.
his archive. He did write about that.
I imagine it would have been 72, 73, and
Yeah,
75.
it seems it was in the 70s. Yes, that's true.
Oh.
Yeah, well, I have to.
He would have been held in the prison in Tura. Let me see if I have Tura here somewhere.
And we have his books, by the way, in our library. And for those who wanna consult with these materials, I don't know where Andrew's based, but maybe you'll visit us.
Yeah, we've been working with the family and doing research on him for the last 3 years, actually.
Yeah.
And he's an amazing person. He has approximately 1,600 articles that we try to digitize now.
Amazing. I look forward to sorting through those papers when they can be made available to me.
Okay, thank you both. So the other question from Andrew to Meitha. First of all, thank you, Andrew, for praising our symposium. And then the question is from the research on the use of smell in spiritual and medical spaces, the use of photography for communal reflection and engagement, using archives in real time to awaken the past and maybe even help research and to a dynamic artistic expression in prison. Do these projects change your perspective of time and how you engage with time in your personal life? Are you more inclined to share photos with friends, but put incense in your rooms, behave in ways to prevent prison sentences? So it's not only to Meitha, sorry, but Meitha, you can answer if you like.
I think there is something quite fascinating about preservation in architecture right now, where they're thinking about preserving scents, like either the smell of cigarettes in old leather chairs. And I think that's where my interest sort of gravitate towards is how do you keep the smell of a room or a place intact? But on the other end, it's the smell of the people I love and their perfumes and that also stay with me. So I guess it's like between body and using perfume on yourself. And I don't know if that answers your question, but that's how I use scent or think about scent today.
So another question from Antonia Carver. I was wondering how the panelists see their archival research and practices being played out in contemporary architecture, arts, literature, and social norms today. Are there ways in which today's world is learning from these histories? If Meitha, I need time and someone else has a answer. Yes? Yes?
I can give it, I need time to think.
Okay.
I mean, I can take.
Yes, please. I was coming to you.
I mean, definitely, I consider my work as a whole, so I don't dissociate between the research part and the production part. All of that is part of my art practice. And how can we learn from it? I mean, I learn from it. I mean, I try to show the things that I learn mostly, but I do hope that others would learn from it too. If not, there is no interest maybe. Or maybe I'm contradicting myself, because we do our work for the future, definitely. I feel like I've taken something from past generation, and it's my duty to give it to the next generation. So I'm a bridge between past and future, and it's there where responsibility is. So I do hope that what I'm interested in will be helpful for future generations.
Thank you, Akram. There's another question for you. Okay, you have a compliment on your beautiful answer from Antonia Carver. There's another question from our team member, the archivist in the Al Mawrid, Ibrahim Muhammad Ali. He's asking you from an archival perspective. He's wondering if there is a plan to house both collections, the Hashim Madani's collection and your collection of photographs, together under the same repository to preserve the integrity of the body of work, given that both collections cover the same subjects across two distinct time periods.
Thank you, but this is really complicated because of the institution. The Arab Image Foundation is an autonomous organization. It is true that I'm one of the co-founders, but I'm not part of it today, and I like to respect that the foundation decides on its own about new collections. So I'm not in a position to impose. Maybe I would propose, but I wanted to tell you that Hashim al-Madani's collection ended up being in two locations. After he died, I mean, before he died, I acquired from him what remained in his studio. And 10 years before, I had transported the things I'm interested in to the Arab Image Foundation. So the things I'm interested in are at the Arab Image Foundation. The things I'm less interested in, I ended up acquiring from him because I did not want them to be thrown away or end up with what do you call them, flea market stuff. I did not want people to mess with the rest of the collection. This is why I acquired it. The plan for the future is that how we unify the two parts of the same collection. My work on Madani is another story, but I don't know if the foundation in the future will be interested in it. We'll see.
Might be interesting that it's in two different archives, and then there are these many ways for also navigating the same way that Meitha is looking through history to link things together. I think that would be also interesting. I also have a question to Afra. Now that you have heard also the other like answers to thinking about archives and how much we are thinking about the moment that we are in, as we like how much we are preparing the moment we are in to be looked at in the future as an archive somehow. What do you feel the most difficult? Like, what do you feel difficult for you to deal with this consciousness? What do you feel that there's too much attention being given to, or not? Maybe the other way around. So, for instance, you said you were in that performance, sitting, pulling out like the seeds from rice, and that was like very monotonous work and just like inside you and your world, versus other many things happening. How much do you feel? Which one did you want people on that day to look at? Maybe that's one entry point into the question.
I'm going to answer backwards. So what do I want people to look at? I don't think that I was, I don't think I thought about in terms of like, do I want people to look at me, or do I want them to enjoy Isa's music, or, you know, the fantastic work that my other collaborators were doing with this, right? Because both my collaborators, the composer and the light designer, come from a theater background. So there's also that kind of like segue in my work into like performance and theater and like thinking about experiential practices. But then what does that mean? I think that what I really wanted to bring to the attention of my audience, and that's something that I like intensively discussed with my team, is that how do we bring people's consciousness to the present moment, to be actually very aware that, you know, now it's fast, now it's slow, or now the structure is moving versus like Isa is moving, like converting into another instrument. And while that happens, we realized in rehearsals that it actually gets overwhelming, even for us. Like I had to meditate before the session to actually keep my calm and consistently be just moving rice on my plate. And that was also mic'd up. So I was I was actually moving the rice on a clay plate. So that was mic'd up. So actually I was the bass for the whole performance. You would hear like throughout the whole performance. And so that rhythmic presence kind of became almost like the anchor to the audience, or I hoped that it would be the anchor for the audience. Whenever it gets overwhelming, they can always look back at me and find that one consistent thing that's constantly in the same moment and in the same movement. And I think that that's something that I constantly yearn for in my practice, is consistency in what we do, and like in process, moving from one thing to the other, consistency. And moving back to the beginning of your question, which is what do I want from, let's say, like, how do we archive, or do we archive? I honestly think we don't archive enough our participations and our exhibitions. And I think that there's a lot happening at the moment. And a lot of times it just gets, you know, there's a new commission or a new exhibition, and then you move to the next one, and people forget that and reference the new, and especially with social media, like you're constantly moving from one thing to another. And I think that institutions should play a bigger role in actually documenting and preserving. And now, like with social media, it became a thing that almost like as it comes as a package. When you accept participating in an exhibition, you also accept being interviewed and do like a 1 minute roll up for social media and so on. And I don't know how I feel about these things. You know, I think that there's more content that needs to be documented and preserved than actually just, you know, there's a group exhibition here, Afra did a solo show, you know, Akram did something in Sharjah, and moving on. So I think that there needs to be a pause. There needs to be a reflection moment where, how do we move forward from this? What are we actually moving towards? Yeah.
I think that's a fantastic point to close on. Thank you very, very much, all of you. I think this was a fascinating panel. I was very happy to hear all of you present, but also respond and open further on your thoughts about archives and spatial constructions.